Life. The room went dead quiet. A 17-year-old boy stood alone at a government counter in Portland, Oregon, clutching a folder of documents that a uniformed lieutenant was already laughing at, chuckling. Laughing the kind that fills a waiting room and makes strangers look away from second-hand embarrassment. "It's your mother," Lieutenant Marcus Vail said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Was a warehouse worker, not a combat medic, not special operations, a warehouse worker. Ethan." Cole didn't move. "These documents are fabricated." Vail continued, dropping the folder on the counter like trash. "And if you file this application, I will personally refer your family for fraud investigation." Fine. Then the building shook, every window rattled. The fluorescent lights flickered. And through the heavy glass doors at the end of the hall, the silhouettes of dozens of tactical K9s appeared, moving in formation, controlled and silent, followed by a woman in faded scrubs and an old jacket who walked like she owned every room she'd ever entered. The lieutenant's smile disappeared. If this story already has you leaning forward, subscribe, hit the like button, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened in that office didn't start with Ethan. Started 20 years earlier in a place that doesn't exist on any public map. The waiting room at Raven Creek Naval Medical Center smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, the kind of place designed to process people efficiently rather than make them feel welcome. Panels buzzed overhead. A laminated sign on the wall read, "Veterans Benefits Administration, please have all documentation ready," in bold letters that had started to peel at the corners. 3 plastic chairs were occupied by men in their 60s and 70s, each holding folders of their own, each staring at nothing in particular with the practiced patience of people who'd spent years waiting for institutions to do right by them. Ethan Cole was 17, and he did not have that kind of patience. He sat on the edge of his chair, knee bouncing the folder on his lap, stuffed with everything he'd spent the last 3 weeks collecting. Medical certification records. Service dates, a letter from a records office in Virginia that had taken him 4 phone calls and 2 written requests to obtain. His mother didn't know he was here. She didn't know he'd spent his lunch breaks researching the benefits she qualified for and had never once applied to collect. She didn't know a lot of things he'd done in the past 6 months, since the hospital bills started arriving, and she started working double shifts without complaint and pretending it was fine. Maya was very good at pretending things were fine. He'd learned that about her over the years, the way she moved through hardship without naming it, the way she absorbed difficulty and kept walking. When the car died, she fixed it herself. When the landlord raised the rent, she picked up weekend clinic hours. Ethan asked her once why she never talked about her time in the service. She'd handed him a glass of water and changed the subject with such smooth efficiency that it took him 10 minutes to realize the conversation had ended. He knew she'd been a medic, he knew she'd served. Beyond that, her past felt like a room with a locked door present in the architecture of the house, but never opened, never explained. The number above the service counter ticked over. A woman in her 40s stood and walked to the window. Ethan watched her go, then looked back down at his folder, checking for the 4th time that everything was in order. He hadn't noticed the man behind the counter until the woman stepped away and his number appeared on the display. Lieutenant Marcus Vail had the kind of face that belonged in a certain type of office. Broad-jawed, square-shouldered, wearing his uniform, with the specific posture of someone who had spent years making sure other people knew he was wearing a uniform. He was maybe 45, with close-cropped graying hair and small eyes that moved quickly over whoever stood in front of him, cataloging and categorizing in the first 3 seconds. Ethan approached the window and slid the folder through the gap under the glass. Benefits. Claim, he said, for my mother, Maya Reynolds. She was a combat medic. Service dates are in there, 2001 through 2009. I have her discharge records and a verification letter from Maya. Vail hadn't opened the folder yet. He was still looking at Ethan. How old are you? 17. Where's your mother? Talking. She doesn't know I'm here. Ethan kept his voice level. I'm filing on her behalf. The form allows for family members to initiate a claim if I know what the form allows. Vail pulled the folder toward him with 2 fingers and opened it with the attitudes of someone expecting to find exactly what they expected to find. He flipped through the first few pages slowly, reading nothing, scanning for something to land on. Then he stopped, his jaw shifted slightly. Special operations attachment, he said, not asking. Combat. Medic classification 3, yes. She was assigned to my site. She was a warehouse worker. Vail said it the way people state facts about weather. Certain mildly bored Maya Reynolds. I can run the name right now, but I already pulled a cross-reference when I saw the submission flag this morning. She worked medical supply logistics out of a base in Fort Callan. Inventory. That's not combat medicine, son. That's counting bandages. Ethan felt the words land but didn't let them knock him off balance. 5. The verification letter explains that certain service records are classified. 5. The woman at the Virginia office told me that some assignments don't appear in the standard database because they're classified. Vail smiled slightly. Every family that walks in here with a story about a secret mission uses that word, classified. You know what I've found over 12 years behind this window? When something is classified, we know about it through proper channels, and it shows up in the system with a redaction flag, not an absence. Your mother's file has no redaction flag, no special designation. Top-tier classification. Nothing. He closed the folder and slid it back. What it has is 8 years of supply inventory records and a standard medical certification that would qualify her for level 1 benefits. What you're claiming. I'm not claiming anything that isn't documented. She ran classified combat operations. Vail's voice rose just slightly, the way someone's voice rises when they want the room to hear them making a point. You're claiming she was attached to elite units. You're claiming service records that don't exist in any database I have access to. He leaned forward an inch. Do you know what the legal term is for filing a fraudulent military benefits claim? The waiting room was very quiet. One of the older men had looked up from his folder. A woman near the door with a stroller had turned her head slightly. Athens, the receptionist at the side desk, was suddenly very focused on her computer screen. I'm not filing fraud, Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but it wasn't shaking. My mother served. She qualifies. Mother, Vail said, was a warehouse worker who apparently told her kid a very exciting story about her past. He picked up a stamp and pressed it onto the top form in the folder with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Insufficient documentation. I'm rejecting this application. If you'd like to reapply with verified documentation that actually exists in the system, you're welcome to do so. If you submit this same claim again with the same unsupported tier classification, I will flag it for fraud review, and your family will hear from the legal division. He pushed the folder back through the gap. Next. Ethan didn't move next. She has scars, Ethan said. It came out quieter than he intended, less composed, which was the honest version of what was happening inside him. On her back, her left shoulder, her forearm. She wakes up sometimes at 3 in the morning and sits in the kitchen until dawn, and she never tells me why. She has a medical bag in the back of her closet that has instruments in it. I looked up online and they are not what you use in a supply warehouse. She speaks 3 languages. She never taught me. She knows things. Stop. His throat had tightened in a way he didn't want it to. Back. She's not lying. She never lied to me. Marcus Vail looked at him for a moment with something in his expression that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite pity. It was closer to the look someone gives a child who has just explained very earnestly that the monster under the bed is real. Home, son, he said. And then the building shook. It wasn't loud. At first, a low vibration that came up through the floor, traveled through the plastic chairs, rattled the laminated sign on the wall. Everyone in the room looked up at the same time with the specific alert confusion of people who hadn't expected anything to happen today. And the sound resolved into something recognizable. Pause. Dozens of them. Moving in unison, disciplined and heavy, not the sound of dogs running loose, but the sound of trained animals moving in coordinated formation down a linoleum hallway. Doors at the far end of the waiting room were solid and dark and had a small rectangular window at eye level. Ethan turned toward them without deciding to through the glass. He could see movement, a lot of movement. The doors swung open. They came in 2 columns, Belgian Malinois mostly, with a few German shepherds mixed in, each wearing a tactical vest marked with numbers and unit insignia, each moving beside a handler in a crisp leash formation that required the handlers to almost jog to keep the pace calm. Ethan counted without thinking about counting 12, 18, 20 more still coming through the door. The animals were focused, heads forward, interested in the room's occupants, distracted. They moved with a precision that made the waiting room feel suddenly small. The older veterans in the chairs straightened instinctively. One of them, a man with a weathered face and a VFW pin on his jacket lapel, actually stood behind the handlers, walking alone at a pace that belonged to someone who was neither rushing nor strolling. Came a woman in faded green scrubs and a canvas jacket that had been washed enough times that the original color was a matter of interpretation. She was maybe mid-40s with dark hair pulled back without ceremony, and a face that might have been tired or might have been very, very controlled. Ethan couldn't tell from this distance. And then she was closer and he still couldn't tell eyes, because his mother's face had always operated on a frequency he'd never fully learned to read. Maya Reynolds walked to the center of the waiting room and stopped. Ethan's. Every K9 in the room sat simultaneously. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of people recalibrating what they thought was happening. Marcus Vail had come around from behind the counter. There must have been a door. Ethan hadn't noticed it before and was standing at the edge of the service area with the expression of someone who had prepared for a Thursday and gotten something else entirely. This is a restricted. I know what it is, Maya said. Her voice was the same voice that had told Ethan to do his homework and eat something before he went to school. And it was also somehow not that voice at all. It was at the same frequency, the same tone, but stripped of the warmth that colored it at home. What remained was something Ethan didn't have a word for at 17. He would find the word later. It was authority, not the performed kind that Vail wore in his uniform, but the earned kind that didn't need a costume. She looked at Vail. She looked at him the way someone looks at a door they need to open and are already calculating how much force is required. My son was here, she said. Your son filed a fraudulent. My son filed an accurate claim. She said, using documents I should have filed myself years ago, which is on me, not him. She took a breath. I understand you rejected it, the tier classifications. It doesn't appear in your database, she said. I know exactly what appears in your database and what doesn't, and why, and who made that decision, and when. She paused. Do you want to have this conversation out here? Or would you like to step into whatever room passes for private in this building? Elle's jaw worked. Somewhere behind him, the receptionist had stopped pretending to type. I am. Without proper I have documentation, Maya said. She reached into the inner pocket of the canvas jacket and produced a sealed envelope. It was not a big envelope. It was not marked with any official-looking header or government seal. It was a plain manila-colored envelope with a number printed on it in black ink. Not a name, not an address, just a number. She set it on the counter between them. Vail looked at it. He didn't pick it up. That number, Maya said, corresponds to a case file that was sealed under executive order in 2007. If you run it in the restricted access database, which I know you have behind that counter, because this is a naval facility and all naval benefits offices at this tier have restricted access terminals, it will open and then you'll understand what Ethan was trying to tell you. I don't take documentation from what? She said it evenly without heat. From warehouse workers. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Ethan saw at the exact moment Vail understood that the conversation he'd had with Ethan had been repeated to this woman and that she was standing here because of it. And that the ground beneath his certainty was now slightly less solid than it had been 20 minutes ago. Vail started. You were told what the database shows. Database shows what it was authorized to show. That's how classified records work, Lieutenant. Maya's voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature. It was the steadiness that made it something. I spent 8 years in assignments that aren't documented in systems. You have clearance to access. That's not a story my son made up. That's not a fabrication. It's a security structure that was put in place to protect ongoing operations and the people involved in them. She glanced at Ethan briefly, just a glance quick and precise, carrying something in it that he couldn't fully decode. My son knew enough to file the claim. He didn't know why the records looked the way they looked because I never told him. It's my mistake. Vail was quiet for a long moment. The K9 handlers stood motionless. The dogs sat still with the specific stillness of animals that had been trained past instinct into something closer to discipline. The number, Maya said. Please. Something in the please did it, not the word itself, but the way she said it, which was the way someone says a word when they're giving you the courtesy of a choice they know you're going to make. It was the please of someone who already knows the outcome of the room. Kyle picked up the envelope. He looked at the number on it. He looked at Maya. Then he went back behind the counter, and Ethan heard the specific sound of a keyboard and a different system booting up different from the standard click-through of the public database. A lower hum, a longer processing pause. The waiting room stayed quiet. Nobody pretended to read anything. Nobody looked at their phones. The older man with the VFW pin was still standing. Ethan moved to stand beside his mother. She didn't reach for him, didn't put an arm around his shoulders, didn't do the mom thing. But she shifted her stance slightly so that her left shoulder was closer to him, and that was enough. How did you know I was here? He said low. You left the verification letter on the kitchen table, she said. From Virginia beat. You're not as subtle as you think. He almost said I was trying to help, but it felt redundant, and she knew. Always knew, Mom. He kept his voice down the things I told him. The bag in the closet. The languages. I shouldn't have. You told the truth, she said. That's fine. He laughed at me. Maya was quiet for a moment. Her eyes stayed on the counter where Vail had gone. Fine. No, she said. The keyboard sound stopped. There was a longer pause. And then from behind the counter, the sound Marcus Vail made was not a word. It was the involuntary intake of breath that happens when something small and solid lands in the stomach. The sound of a man realizing the size of the mistake he has made. He came back to the window. Slowly his face had undergone a change that wasn't quite readable as one emotion. It was somewhere in the intersection of professional alarm and personal recalibration. The look of someone who had been very confident 5 minutes ago and was now calculating what confidence was worth. Reynolds, he said. The shift from ma'am to her name was small and enormous simultaneously. Is sealed, she said. I know, but you can see enough. Your son listed as he stuttered again. It's accurate. I know the service dates are accurate. Yes. He looked at the folder on the counter, Ethan's folder stamped Dennied in red. He looked at the stamp, he set it down again. Your son was applying for is correct, Maya said. I qualify for. It's what I should have applied for years ago. Didn't you? Vail said it carefully like a man testing ice. Maya looked at him for a moment. Because I didn't want to explain what the file would show, she said. And because I didn't need it at the time, she paused. I need it now. Vail nodded. He picked up the folder again, turned it over and reached for a different stamp. Ethan watched him press it, watched the red nib disappear under the clean black rectangle of a revision marker, watched new paperwork materialize from a drawer and get placed on top of the old paperwork. I'll need to process this through the restricted benefits channel, Vail said. It won't come through the standard system. It'll take 48 hours to route correctly. I understand, Maya said. Vail looked at Ethan. Something crossed his face, not an apology, not exactly, but the closest thing a man who had never apologized in a professional setting could manufacture on short notice. Documentation was in order, he said, which was not what he'd said 40 minutes ago, but Ethan let it sit without comment. Maya picked up the envelope from the counter, tucked it back into her jacket. She looked at the room, the handlers, the dogs, the veterans in the chairs, who were all watching her with the specific look of people who had lived long enough to recognize something real when they saw it. Thank you, she said to the room at large, and then to the K9 handler specifically, we're done here. They moved out in the same formation they'd arrived in, unhurried, the sound of paws retreating down the hallway, and then fading into whatever outside world they'd come from. The door at the far end swung shut. The waiting room felt larger without them. Ethan followed his mother toward the main exit folder under his arm, questions accumulating behind his teeth that he hadn't decided yet whether to ask. Afternoon light through the glass doors was the kind of flat Pacific gray that Portland did in October, diffused without shadows, making everything look slightly more real than it was. He pushed through the door and was 2 steps into the parking lot when she spoke. You should have told me you were filing, she said, accusatory. Just you would have told me not to. She considered this. I was handling the bills. He stopped walking. She didn't for 2 more steps, and then she stopped too and turned around. You work 12-hour shifts and you come home and you heat up something from a can and you go to sleep and you don't ask for anything from anyone. He looked at her. I know you were handling it. I know you would have kept handling it until something broke. I wasn't going to wait for something to break. Maya Reynolds looked at her son for a long moment. The October wind moved through the parking lot and pressed against the canvas jacket and went nowhere. You filed without knowing the file was sealed, she said. You went in there without knowing what you were going to hit. I hit a lieutenant who called you a warehouse worker. Fine. And then Ethan thought about it, and then I told him the truth anyway. She was quiet for another moment. Then she turned and kept walking toward the car, and Ethan fell into step beside her. And the conversation closed the way. Conversations with Maya Reynolds always closed not with resolution. Exactly, with a weight to it like a door that latched without locking. He didn't ask yet about the number on the envelope. He didn't ask about what Vail had seen on that restricted terminal that had changed the color of the man's face. He didn't ask about the K9 unit or who had called them or how a woman in scrubs and an old jacket had arrived at a naval medical facility with 20-plus tactical dogs in formation like it was a Thursday morning errand. He didn't ask yet because his mother had gotten into the driver's seat and was sitting there with her hands on the steering wheel and her eyes on something past the windshield. And her face was doing the thing it did sometimes at 3 in the morning in the kitchen present, and somewhere else at the same time carrying weight that had no visible shape. He got in the passenger seat. She started the car. They drove for 4 minutes in silence, and then Maya said, without looking at him, "In 2004 there was an operation in a location I'm not going to name. Of soldiers. One medic." She paused at a light. 3 of them came home. Ethan didn't say anything. "That was the medic," she said. The light turned green. She didn't say anything else, and he didn't ask her to, and they drove back toward home through the flat gray afternoon, and Ethan sat with what she'd given him, not the whole story, not even close, but a corner of it, a timestamp, a number 5. 3 out of 12, one medic. He stared at the road ahead. Behind them, in the parking lot of Raven Creek Naval Medical Center, Marcus Vail was sitting at his desk, staring at a computer screen that had just shown him a restricted file he would spend the next 72 hours trying to figure out how to explain to his supervisor, because the file didn't show Maya Reynolds' classified service record. It showed something else, a flag, a status designation, and a list of names attached to her file that included 3 active senior officers and 1 admiral who, as of this morning, still had access to her location data. He put it down. He picked it up again. He put it down again, and then he sat very still for a long time, staring at the name at the bottom of the flag notification. Not a name he recognized, but a rank he did. And that rank was enough to make his stomach do something unpleasant. Drive home. Took 22 minutes in October traffic, and Maya spent most of it in the particular silence she'd developed over years of driving alone at odd hours. Not uncomfortable silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had learned that most things didn't need to be said out loud to be communicated. She kept both hands on the wheel. She checked her mirrors at regular intervals, not anxious, just habitual. Watched the city slide past his window and thought about 12 soldiers and 3 who came home, and a number on a plain manila envelope, and the sound Marcus Vail's breath had made when the screen loaded. When they pulled into the driveway of the rental house on Caraway Street, Maya sat for a moment before cutting the engine. The house was small and needed paint on the south-facing trim, and had a front yard that Ethan mowed every other Saturday. Looked exactly like what it was, a place where 2 people lived carefully within their means. "You're going to have questions," she said. "I already have questions." "No," she turned off the engine. "Some of them I can answer. I can't, or won't." She opened the door and got out, and he followed her, and they went inside. The kitchen was the room in the house that felt most like her. Nothing decorative, nothing extra, but clean in a way that was almost military. Everything in a designated position, the dish rack empty, because she didn't let dishes sit. She put the kettle on without asking him if he wanted anything, and pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, whilst Ethan sat down at the kitchen table, which had a scratch on the left corner he'd made at age 11, and she'd never mentioned once. "Operation in 2004, he said. "The one you told me about in the car." I shouldn't have told you that much in the car." She wasn't looking at him, watching the kettle. "I had a moment. It won't become a habit." She turned around, and her face was doing the controlled thing again. But there was something under it that had a fissure in it, something that had cracked slightly, maybe today, maybe just enough to let a small amount of light through. "What do you actually need to know?" She said. "Everything," he said. "That's not how this works." "Then what's the version that explains the dogs?" he said. "Because I think I deserve that one." Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the expression that came before smiling, when you weren't sure if smiling was appropriate yet. She poured the water and brought both mugs to the table and sat across from him. "The unit that owns those dogs," she said, "is called the Ridgeway Canine Tactical Group. Doctor, the Retired Handler Association. The dogs are retired too, most of them. Since they do ceremony work, security consulting, and occasionally." She paused, chose a word. "Escort work. Escort work for people who were attached to certain programs. There are protocols if a protected service record is being mishandled by a government office. There's a notification system. Most people who set it up are retired or dead." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I set it up a long time ago. I forgot I still had it active, honestly. I thought I'd deactivated it when I left Portland the first time." "You lived here before for a year after Fort Callan." She looked at the table. "The notification went out when your claim was flagged in the restricted system. Someone in the Ridgeway group got it and called me." "Who's someone I served with who?" he said again. She looked up. "His name is Dennis Fair. He was a handler in the unit that worked with us on the 2004 operation. He's retired now. He runs the Ridgeway group as a nonprofit." She said it simply, no embellishment, the way she said most things. He called me at work. I was in the middle of a shift at the clinic, and he called me, and he said your name, and I left. 5. Ethan held that image for a moment, his mother mid-shift in her scrubs, receiving a phone call with his name in it, and just leaving. Deliberation. You didn't tell me you were coming, he said. It wasn't time. She took a sip of the tea, and I wanted to see the room before you saw me in it. What about that? Why? Because if I walked in and you were falling apart, I needed to handle it differently than if you were still standing. She says it matter-of-factly, not cruelly. 5. You were still standing, barely you were standing, she said. That counts. He looked at his mug outside. The wind was picking up. The south-facing window flexed slightly in its frame, and Ethan made a note to himself to check the weather stripping this weekend. 5. And then felt vaguely surreal that he was making practical notes while sitting across from a version of his mother he was only just beginning to understand existed. 9. Number on the envelope, he said. The one you gave Vail. Kid. What did he see when he ran it? Maya set her mug down. 9. She aligned it carefully with the edge of the placemat, and the carefulness of that small gesture told Ethan more than he would have been able to articulate. A service file, she said. The real one, not the logistics classification, not the inventory records. Underneath. She looked at him, and probably the flag. Flag. Anytime someone tries to pull a protected record without appropriate clearance, a notification goes out, she said. Not to the person who pulled it, to the people listed in the record's security contact field. She paused. There are 3 names in my contact field. One of them is Admiral Karen Bryce, Pacific Command. Ethan stared at her. She was the officer who authorized the 2004 operation, Maya said. She's been in my contact field since 2007 because she put herself there. She picked her mug up again. 5. I didn't ask her to. He didn't say anything for a moment, turning that over, looking at the shape of it. Admiral. Self-inserted into his mother's file 12 years ago. Is she going to call, he said. She may already have, Maya said, and pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. 5. She looked at the screen without expression, then set it on the table face up. 5. Missed call from a number with a Washington, D. area code. Ethan looked at the calls. He looked at his mother. 5. She was looking at the phone with the expression of someone calculating, not panicking, adding up what needed to happen next and in what order. 5. You're going to call her back, he said. Yes, tonight? Not tonight, she said. Tonight I'm going to cook something that isn't from a can, and you're going to do the homework you didn't do this afternoon because you were sitting in a government waiting room. Laughed. It was so deeply mundane that Ethan actually laughed, a short surprised sound that he hadn't expected to make today, and Maya looked at him with that precursor to a smile expression. And for a moment the kitchen felt like the kitchen again, familiar and cramped and theirs. But later, at 11:43, when he was supposed to be asleep and wasn't, he lay in his room, listening to the sound of his mother's voice through the wall too low to make out words. Just tone, just cadence, just the specific register of someone who was not asking for things, but was not being asked either, who was speaking as an equal to someone on the other end, who understood exactly what that meant. The call lasted 18 minutes after it ended. The house was quiet. Ethan stared at the ceiling. He heard his mother walk to the kitchen, fill a glass of water, walk to the door of her room. Pause. I know you're awake, she said through his door. Fine. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be longer. He didn't ask what that meant. He filed it in the accumulating folder of things he didn't ask, yet closed his eyes and lay there in the dark while his brain refused to turn off for another 90 minutes. At 6:15 to the smell of actual coffee, the real kind. Not the instant that lived in the cabinet above the stove, but the ground kind from the paper bag they only opened on weekends. He came downstairs to find Maya already dressed. Same scrubs, different jacket, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone and a legal pad and a pen she'd used enough that the grip had worn shiny. There was a man at the table with her. He was maybe 60, built like someone who had once been physically imposing and had settled into a compact, economical version of it in retirement. He had a gray-streaked beard, trimmed close, and wore a plain khaki jacket over a flannel shirt. There was a Belgian Malinois sitting next to his chair that lifted its blocky head when Ethan came down the stairs and then lowered it again, unconcerned. This is Dennis Farr, Maya said, without preamble. Ethan. The man nodded at Ethan. Your mother says you put together a solid file, he said. His voice was the kind that had spent a lot of time outdoors. You're selling it. I looked at the documents. You were thorough. Ethan looked at his mother. She was making a face that was not quite an apology for the ambush. You could have told me someone was going to be here, he said. I told you tomorrow would be longer, she said. That's not the same thing. That's enough. She nodded at the coffee pot. Sit down. He sat, poured himself coffee, and looked at Dennis Farrar with the particular assessment that teenagers deploy when an adult has appeared in their kitchen without adequate explanation. What did my mother tell you about yesterday? Farrar leaned back in his chair. Enough. I got the notification flag before she did faster routing through the Ridgeway network. When I saw Vail's name and the rejection code, I knew what he'd done. He shook his head slightly. I've seen it before. Officers with restricted access terminals who use the fact that they can't see classified records to argue those records don't exist. Fuzzy, and it's wrong. And in your mother's case, it is specifically the kind of wrong that has consequences. Kind of consequences. Ethan said. Farrar looked at Maya. That's what I'm about to explain, she said. She turned to Ethan. Admiral Bryce called last night. I heard you. She's aware of what Vail did. Notification went to her directly. Maya set her pen down on the legal pad. She wants to bring this through official channels. Formal review of how Vail handled the application and a formal correction of the record. That sounds good, Ethan said. It is good, Maya said. It's also going to require me to answer some questions. I haven't answered in 8 years. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The Malinois at Pfeffer's feet shifted, reset its chin on its front paws. What kind of questions? Ethan said. The kind with a classified debrief attached, Maya said. There are parts of the 2004 operation that were never formally closed. I walked away from the debrief process because she stopped the fissure again, that hairline crack in the controlled surface. She put it back. I was not in a condition to complete it at the time. Time kept moving and I kept not going back, and eventually I had you to take care of, and Portland was quiet, and I told myself it was done. But it wasn't done, Ethan said. It was never done, she said. I just stopped looking at it. Farrar poured himself more coffee and said nothing, which Ethan appreciated. The man clearly understood when a conversation between two people needed a third person to simply take up space. If you go through the review process, Ethan said, what happens to Vail? It's a separate track, Maya said. The review of his conduct goes to his commanding officer. Ethan pressed. Maya looked at him for a moment. He loses his position at minimum, she said. If the investigators find a pattern and Farrar says there may be one, he could face formal misconduct charges. Thought about the waiting room, the sound of the stamp. A warehouse worker. The way the older veterans in the chairs had gone carefully still. The way the receptionist had studied her screen. The way Vail's voice had risen just enough to make sure the room heard him take apart a 17-year-old's credibility. Is there a pattern? He said. Farrar answered. We've had 3 other Ridgeway members go through that office in the past 4 years. 2 of them had similar experiences, records, questioned, tier classifications disputed, applications denied on insufficient documentation grounds when the documentation was actually correct. He set his mug down. One of them went away quietly. The other one pushed back and was told. He was confused about his own service record. A pause. He was a 22-year combat veteran. The number settled in the kitchen. So Vail's been doing this, Ethan said. It appears he has, Farrar said. Farrar and Maya exchanged a look that contained a small, dense conversation Ethan couldn't fully translate. Said power most of the time, that's what it is. At a desk. He controls what gets approved and what doesn't. People come to him needing something and he decides what they get. He shrugged, not dismissively, but practically. Some people find that satisfying in ways that turn bad over time. Ethan looked at his coffee. He thought about his mother working 12-hour shifts. He thought about the envelope, the number, the sealed file. About Vail's face, when the screen loaded, the blood-drain quality of it, the way the confidence had evacuated so completely and quickly that it left a kind of hollow in the man's expression. When does the review start, he said. It may have already started, Maya said. Doesn't move slowly. The next 2 days were strange in the specific way that waiting is strange, full of small ordinary moments that felt inadequate to the size of what was moving beneath them. Ethan went to school. He sat through chemistry and history, and an English class where they were finishing All Quiet on the Western Front, which he found under the circumstances almost funny. He ate lunch with his friend group and didn't say anything about any of it, because there wasn't a version of it he could explain in the 11 minutes before the bell. Maya worked her shifts and came home and made actual food both nights, which told Ethan more about her internal state than any conversation would have. She cooked when she was processing something. It was the outlet she'd never named as an outlet. On the second morning, Dennis Farrar came back. He had a woman with him this time, late 40s, short gray streaked hair, civilian clothes, but the posture of someone who wore something less casual in a different context. She introduced herself as Tasal Class Lidibaya Okafor, retired, and said she was the Ridgeway Group's legal liaison, which Ethan translated as she knows what can and can't be filed and by whom. Admiral moved quickly. Okafor told him, sitting in the same chair Farrar had used 2 days before. 5. An investigator from the Naval Inspector General's office contacted Vail's commanding officer yesterday. Maya, standing at the counter, crossed her arms. What did the CO say? 5. He was cooperative, Okafor said, which suggests he either genuinely didn't know what Vail was doing or knew and is smart enough to not be caught defending it. She paused. Either way, he pulled Vail's access to restricted terminal pending review. Vail is currently on administrative hold. That was fast, Ethan said. Okafor looked at him. She had the direct, calibrated gaze of someone who did not waste their assessments. 5. Your mother has a specific status in the system, she said. 9. When someone with that status has a mishandling complaint, it doesn't sit in a queue. What status, he said. Okafor looked at Maya, who didn't answer right away. It's a designation, Maya said. It means certain protections were built into my file after the 2004 operation. I didn't request them, Bryce put them there. She said it carefully, like she was walking across something she wasn't certain would hold. 5. It means my record can't be questioned or acted upon by any officer below a certain clearance level without triggering a review. Ethan worked this out. So what Vail did was not just unprofessional, Okafor said. It was a violation of a specific regulatory protection. 5. He questioned a protected record without the clearance to do so, issued a denial based on information he was not authorized to interpret, and threatened a family member with legal action for filing an accurate claim. She listed these the way someone lists items on a form specifically, without drama. Each of those is a separate finding. The kitchen felt smaller than it usually did. He's done, Ethan said. He's not done yet, Okafor said, with the precision of someone who had seen careers limp along past the point where common sense suggested they should end. But the process is moving. The IG investigator wants to interview your mother tomorrow. Maya nodded. She had uncrossed her arms. She was looking at the floor, not seeing the floor. In the other 2 cases, Ethan said. The veterans Farrar mentioned. Okafor looked at him again, reevaluating slightly. 5. They've been contacted. If they want to be included in the investigation, they can file statements. That's their choice. She glanced at Farrar. We've reached out. Okafor, who had been quiet, said, As James Whitmore called me this morning. Wants to file. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but Maya looked up at it. Whitmore, she said. Retired infantry, Fort Callan, around 2015. That's him, Farrar said. Vail denied his application twice. Not him. His PTSD diagnosis didn't meet the threshold. He said it flatly, which was worse than if he'd said it with anger. The man has 4 surgeries on record and a traumatic brain injury from Kandahar. 5. The kitchen went quiet. Ethan thought about a room full of people at the Veterans Benefits office, each with their folder, each waiting, depending on a man behind a counter who had decided that his interpretation of a database was more accurate than their lived experience of their own lives. He said. She looked at him. The interview tomorrow. I want to come, Ethan. Not inside. I'm not asking to be in the room. He held her gaze. I just want to come. Maya looked at him for a long moment with the expression she reserved for the moments when he hit something that surprised her, not the small surprises, but the ones that landed deeper than she expected. Once the IG investigator's name was Agent Rachel Sutton, and she arrived at a conference room at Raven Creek Naval Medical Center the next morning with a leather portfolio and a deputy, and a manner that was professionally neutral in the way that suggested she'd had years of practice at not letting her own conclusions show until she was ready to show them. Ethan sat in the hallway outside on a bench that had been there since at least 190, judging by the armrest wear, and watched people pass. He had brought his history homework, which was not getting done. 11:20. The conference room door opened and Marcus Vail walked out. He was in civilian clothes, which Ethan hadn't expected. Hockey slacks, a navy pullover. Without the uniform, he looked both more ordinary and somehow smaller, the way things sometimes do when you remove the thing that was doing most of the visual work. He had an attorney beside him, a woman in a dark suit who was carrying 2 folders and had the look of someone being paid by the hour to look unrattled. Vail saw Ethan. The hallway was not long. There was no reasonable way to not see him. Ethan sat on the bench with his history textbook on his knee, and Vail stopped walking for a fraction of a second, hesitation so small it barely registered, and then kept moving. Ethan didn't say anything. He watched Vail walk to the elevator at the end of the hall, watched the attorney speak to him in a low voice. Ethan couldn't hear, watched Vail's jaw work in that side-to-side motion he'd seen 2 days ago at the counter. The elevator came. They got in, the doors closed. Ethan looked back down at his history textbook. He read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing any of it. At 12:40, Maya came out. She looked tired in a way she hadn't looked before. Not broken, not defeated, but the way someone looks when they've been holding a door closed for a very long time and have finally in a controlled and deliberate way opened it. Afar and Okafor came out behind her. Then Agent Sutton, who said something to Okafor, received a nod and walked back into the conference room with her deputy. His mother walked to him and stopped. She looked at him the same way she'd looked at him in the parking lot 2 days ago, like she was taking his measure, like it still mattered what she found. Long, he said. Are you okay? What about it? I told them about 2004, she said. All of it. The parts I didn't finish in the debrief. She stopped, started again. There were things I never said out loud. Her voice didn't break, but it changed texture slightly, became something less smooth, which for Maya Reynolds was the equivalent of most people coming apart entirely. It's a strange thing saying something out loud that you've only ever carried inside yourself. How, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Later, she said, like she wasn't sure if that was the right word. And heavier. At the same time, Ethan nodded. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything adequate to say to that, and he was starting to understand that the adequate thing and the right thing were often different things with his mother, and that the right thing was usually just being present and not needing her to explain herself further. Okafor says the investigation will include Whitmore's cases, Maya said, settling back into the practical register. And possibly a third applicant they found in Vail's records, a woman named Torres, retired Navy. Her claim was denied 18 months ago on documentation grounds. How many people did he do this to? They're looking, she said. That's what the investigation is for. They were walking toward the exit now, the three of them, Maya, Ethan, Farrar, a few paces behind with the Malinois, and the afternoon light through the medical center's tall windows was doing the same flat October thing it had done 2 days ago. And then Maya's phone rang. She looked at it, stopped walking. She said. She looked at Ethan, something in her face, not fear, but something adjacent to it. Something that the structure of concern without the panic said that this call was not routine. She answered in a pause. Yes, ma'am. Another pause longer. Her jaw tightened fractionally when she listened. I understand. She lowered the phone. Ethan waited. As attorney filed a counter-complaint an hour ago, she said. Farr said behind them. He's claiming that I orchestrated a harassment campaign against him, Maya said. The K9 demonstration was intimidation. That the envelope I gave him was delivered under duress. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that Ethan could hear now, because he was starting to learn to listen below the surface of her. He was requesting that the IG investigation be suspended pending review of my conduct. The hallway was quiet. Someone down the hall dropped something metallic. That's insane, Ethan said. It's a delay tactic, Farrar said, and his voice had gone into a different register, flat and certain in the way that suggested he'd seen this before too, and that it made him more tired than surprised. Great work, as one Maya said. The IG will have to evaluate it before proceeding. Ethan looked at his mother. She was standing in the hallway of Raven Creek Naval Medical Center in her faded scrubs and her canvas jacket and her worn shoes, and she had just spent 4 hours telling an investigator things she'd carried alone for over a decade. And now the man who had called her a warehouse worker in front of a room full of strangers was filing a complaint against her. He said. She was already looking at him. Does Bryce know about the counter-complaint? She's the one who called to tell me about it, Maya said. Did she say? Maya was quiet for a beat. Then she said, and I'm quoting, let him file. I've been waiting for a reason to pull his full personnel history, and now I have one. What's in his personnel history, he said. Maya looked at Farrar looked at the dog at his feet. Then he looked at Ethan with an expression that was the opposite of reassuring in the specific way that honest faces sometimes are. Farr, thou said, is the question. The question hung in the hallway for a moment, and then Farr said, come on, and they walked out into the October afternoon without answering it. Because some questions are better handled in motion than in the still air of institutional corridors where the walls have learned to listen. The Drac was different from the one 2 days ago. Maya drove the same way, both hands, regular mirrors, no unnecessary speed, but the silence had a different texture to it. Now let's settled more like the surface of water before something breaks through from below. Followed in his own truck with the Malinois. And Ethan watched the dog's silhouette in the passenger window of the truck behind them. And the specific phrase, I've been waiting for a reason, and what it meant that Admiral in Pacific Command had been waiting for a reason. Ives. It meant she already knew something. He didn't say that out loud. Science. He filed it at home. Okafor called Maya while they were still in the driveway, and Maya took the call outside while Ethan went in and made sandwiches because there was nothing else useful he could do with his hands. He made 3 guesses at what Farr wanted on his decided cheese and mustard was safe and had them on the table by the time his mother came back in. She looked at the sandwiches. She looked at Ethan. Muffins. Something moved through her expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite amusement, but lived somewhere between them. Okafor says the counter-complaint will be evaluated in parallel, she said, sitting down. It won't actually stop the investigation. It delays the findings going public, but the IG can continue gathering evidence while the complaint is evaluated. It buys him time, Ethan said. About 2 weeks, Farrar said from the doorway, himself in, which suggested he'd been to this house before, which suggested a longer history with Maya than Ethan had fully mapped. Maybe 3 weeks to do what, Ethan said. To find anyone who'll corroborate his version, Farrar said. He sat down and took the sandwich without ceremony, which Ethan appreciated, arguing that Maya arrived with an aggressive canine presence designed to intimidate him into compliance. He'll need people in that waiting room who'll say they felt threatened. Nobody in that room looked threatened, Ethan said. The veteran with the VFW pin stood up. He looked. Ethan searched for the right word. I leaved. Farrar looked at Maya. Maya was eating her sandwich with the focused economy of someone who hadn't eaten since morning and was not going to discuss that. We should get statements from the people in that waiting room, Farrar said. Okafor's already on it, Maya said. Ethan finished half his sandwich and then sat back and looked at his mother across the table, and she was looking back at him in the way she did when she knew he had something to say and was deciding whether to preempt it. He said it anyway. What's in Vail's personnel file? Maya set down the second half of her sandwich. I don't know specifics. But Bryce does, apparently, and she's been sitting on it. Maya was quiet for a moment. She can't pull a personnel file without cause, she said. That's not how it works. Even admirals need a trigger, a complaint, a formal investigation, a flagged incident. She met his eyes. Wow. Now, Ethan thought about this. About a man who had been doing what Vail did not just to his mother, not just to James Whitmore, not just to Torres, doing it for years, behind a counter in a room where people came needing something, and nobody with the authority to stop it had been given enough of a reason to look. Until a 17-year-old filed a benefits claim with a folder of documents and refused to leave. He didn't say that part out loud either, but he thought about it for a long time after they cleared the table, and he was still thinking about it at 9:30 when his mother knocked on his door. There's something I need to show you, she said. He followed her to her room, which he almost never entered, not because she'd forbidden it, but because it had the quality of a space that had been carefully arranged around a specific kind of privacy, and he'd respected that without needing to be told. The room was bed, a dresser, a small bookcase with 3 books, and a collection of things that were practical rather than decorative: a good lamp, a phone charger, a water glass. And in the corner, a closet. She opened it. The bag was on the top shelf canvas, military green, worn smooth at the handles. She reached up and brought it down and set it on the bed, and then she sat beside it and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you've been not looking at for a long time. You said you looked these up, she said. The instruments. Some of them. She unzipped the bag, inside organized in loops and pockets with a precision that clearly hadn't degraded, even after years of sitting undisturbed, were things that Ethan recognized from his research and things he didn't. A field tourniquet, NATO standard hemostatic gauze in sealed packaging, a decompression needle kit, a small sealed case that he knew from 4 different search results, contained a cricothyrotomy kit for emergency airway management. On medic bag, he said. Not a question, Tier 3 field kit, she said. You don't carry this in a supply warehouse. He looked at it. Are you showing me this now? She was quiet for a moment. She reached into the side pocket of the bag and pulled out a photograph. It was old, not damaged, but the colors had the slightly washed quality of photos from the early digital era, and the image was a group of people in tactical gear standing in front of a vehicle that had seen considerable use. People. Some of them were smiling. Most of them were not. Maya was in the second row. She was maybe 25 in the photo, her face carrying the lean, alert quality of someone whose body had been running at high capacity for a long time. She wasn't smiling. She was looking at something to the left of the camera, and her hand was resting on a medical bag, very similar to the one currently open on the bed. Ethan looked at the photo for a long time. He looked at the people he didn't know and would never know, most of them. 12. 3 came home. I'm showing you, Maya said, because tomorrow is going to be more complicated than today, and I don't want you walking into it without understanding what this actually is. She took the photo back and looked at it herself. 5. This isn't about a benefits form anymore, Ethan. It might have started there, but it isn't there now. Is it now? It's a formal military conduct investigation, she said. It's a personnel review, a government employee with access to protected records. Tough. It's potentially the exposure of a pattern of misconduct against veterans who deserved better. She set the photo on the bed between them. 5. And it's a debrief of a classified operation that I walked away from incomplete, which means there are things I said today that are now part of an official record. Are you okay with that? He said. She thought about it. The real version of thinking, not the quick reassurance. I will be, she said. It's the right thing. It should have been done a long time ago. A pause. I wasn't ready a long time ago. What changed? He said. Athens. She looked at him. The answer was so obvious in the way she was looking at him that she didn't need to say it, and she didn't, and he understood. And they sat there in the plain, quiet room, with the canvas bag between them and the photograph, and the October wind doing its thing against the windows. The call came at 7:42 the next morning. Ethan was in the kitchen making toast when he heard his mother's voice shift, not louder, not faster, but tighter, the way a wire gets when tension is applied to it. Nice. He turned around. She was standing near the window, with her phone pressed to her ear, and her free hand had found the edge of the counter and was gripping it not for support, but for something to do while the rest of her body stayed still. She said a pause. How bad another pause longer? I understand. I'm on my way. She lowered the phone and looked at Ethan. Whitmore, she said. He collapsed at his home an hour ago. 5. He's at Providence Medical Center, cardiac event. 5. Is he? He's alive. He's in the ICU. She was already moving, grabbing her jacket from the hook by the door. 5. Called Farrar. Farrar called me. She stopped at the door. 5. I don't know yet what triggered it. His wife said he'd been on the phone with the IG office yesterday afternoon, going through details of his benefit denials. His case files. Going through all of it again. Ethan felt the weight of that land somewhere in his chest. A man with 4 surgeries and a traumatic brain injury, sitting alone with his files, reliving what had been done to him, so he could give a statement to an investigator. I'm coming, Ethan said. You have school, Mom. She looked at him for half a second. Get your jacket, she said. Providence Medical Center was 20 minutes across the city, a larger facility than Raven Creek. The kind of urban hospital that never fully slept, and showed it in the quality of its lighting and the pace of its staff and the particular hum of a place processing too much at once. I drove, and Ethan sat beside her, and neither of them spoke, because there wasn't anything to say that would help move time faster. Farr was already in the waiting area outside the cardiac ICU. When they arrived, he'd gotten there before them, which meant he'd been closer or had driven faster, and the Malinois was not with him, which told Ethan he'd left the house quickly. He was standing rather than sitting, which was the stance of someone who had too much energy to use and nowhere reasonable to put it. Him was a woman in her 60s, small and sharp-eyed, wearing a winter coat that hadn't been grabbed from a hook so much as clutched off a chair. She had the specific look of someone who had been in a hospital before in circumstances like these and had learned to go very quiet and very still as a way of surviving the waiting. Whitmore. Farrar said Maya Reynolds. The two women looked at each other, and there was a moment of recognition that Ethan couldn't fully interpret, not personal recognition, but the recognition of two people who share a category of experience without having met before. How is he? Maya said. They're stabilizing him, Ellen said. Her voice was controlled in the same way that people's voices get controlled when they've been crying recently and have run out of crying for the moment and haven't decided if there's more coming. They said it was a stress-induced arrhythmia. His heart rate went somewhere it shouldn't. She stopped. Reorganized. He was on the phone with the government office for 3 hours yesterday. 3 hours going through everything. And then last night, he couldn't sleep, and he was going through his files again. At 2 in the morning, I woke up, and he wasn't in bed, and I found him at the kitchen table, with all of it spread out. She stopped again. Ethan looked at the floor. He thought about his own mother in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. He thought about what it cost people to keep carrying things that should have been resolved and weren't, because someone behind a counter had decided their records didn't mean what the records meant. I'm sorry, Maya said. She said it without embellishment, which was the right way to say it. And Whitmore looked at her. Farrar told me who you are, she said. You did. The day before yesterday, Maya didn't respond to that. That James wanted to file that statement, Ellen said. Wanted to. He said if there was a chance to make Vail answer for it, he wasn't going to not take it because it was hard. She exhaled slowly. Lines. He's stubborn 22 years in the army, and he's still the most stubborn man I've ever met. That's probably why he survived, Farrar said, quiet and honest. Ellen almost smiled. Not quite. The ICU doors opened, and a doctor came through, young, efficient, with the particular tiredness of someone 3/4 of the way through a long shift. She spoke to Ellen briefly. Used words Ethan mostly understood. Adjustable rhythm. Monitoring period. Cautiously optimistic. No indication of structural damage. Stress management going forward. Ellen nodded at each phrase like she was recording them. When the doctor left, the four of them stood in the waiting area, and the institutional hum of Providence Medical Center continued around them. Maya's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Ethan watched her face. Okafor, she said. She stepped away to take the call, and Ethan stayed near Farrar and Ellen, and he heard his mother's side of the conversation in fragments. Yes. When did that happen? What's the basis? And then a long pause. And then in a voice very flat and very contained, he didn't. She came back. Vail expanded his counter-complaint, she said. He's now alleging that the envelope I gave him contained a threat. The number on it was used to coerce him into accessing a restricted file. He wasn't authorized to access. She said it without inflection. But the jaw muscle thing was happening, that tight fractional shift. He's claiming I manipulated a government official using protected information. Made a sound that was not a word. That's not what happened, Ethan said. I know what happened, Maya said. You know what happened. The people in that waiting room know what happened. She looked at the ICU doors. Vail's attorney is very good at reframing things, and the IG evaluation team has to take the complaint seriously until they don't. Does Okafor say? Farrar asked. She says we need the waiting room witnesses faster. Maya pocketed her phone, and she says Bryce as she used the word activated. Farrar looked at the ceiling briefly. What does that mean in practice? It means the Admiral is personally involved now, Maya said. Not just notified. Involved. A pause. Okafor says she's been on the phone with the IG office since 6 this morning. Ethan processed this: an Admiral on the phone with an Inspector General's office at 6 in the morning about a counter-complaint filed by a mid-level benefits officer. The scale of the response was beginning to tell its own story, and the story was not just about Marcus Vail's conduct toward veterans in a waiting room. There was something larger in Vail's file, something that made Bryce move that fast, and it had been there waiting for the right moment to surface. I need to see Bryce's record, Ethan said. 3 adults looked at him. Not her record, he corrected quickly, because that wasn't what he meant. Files. The personnel history. What does Bryce know about him? I can't access, Farrar said. She can tell us, Ethan said. She will when she's ready. He looked at his mother. She's been waiting for a reason. She has the reason. She's activated. She's going to tell us something. Maya looked at him for a moment. Then she said yes. The call came 4 hours later while they were still at Providence. Ellen had asked them to stay, and they had... And Ethan had done 2 hours of homework in the waiting room chair and eaten a vending machine sandwich that he would not recommend. And when it came not through Maya's phone, but through Okafor, who called Farrar, who put it on speaker, standing in a corner of the waiting room that was temporarily unoccupied. Admiral Karen Bryce had a voice that was not what Ethan had imagined. He'd built unconsciously an image of someone large and formal and operatic in the way of powerful people in films. The real voice was dry and specific and entirely without ceremony, the voice of someone who had long ago stopped performing authority because they no longer needed to. Reynolds, she said, I'm going to share information with you that I wasn't able to share before today because I didn't have grounds. I have grounds now. I'm listening. Maya said. Marcus Vail has been at the Raven Creek Naval Medical Benefits Office for 6 years, Bryce said. That time. There have been 7 internal complaints filed against him. 6 were dismissed at the supervisory level. 1 was referred upward and disappeared in administrative processing. A pause. I'm telling you that not because I think you're surprised, but because I want you to understand the size of what's been sitting there. Complaints. Farrar said 7 that were filed. The actual number of people affected is considerably higher. Most people don't file. Bryce's voice was even carrying the specific resignation of someone who has looked at a system's failure for a long time. What I have now, with grounds to pull the full history, is a pattern. Benefits. Denied redenials on reapplication. Documentation questioned without cause. Protectors accessed and dismissed by an officer who did not have the clearance interpretation to make that call. A pause. And 1 additional item that is why I placed myself in child's contact field in 2007, and why I have been, as I understand it was described, waiting. The waiting room of Providence Medical Center was very quiet around them. In 2006, Bryce said Lieutenant Marcus Vail was a junior officer at the Personnel Records Division at Fort Callan. He had access to a classification database. He was involved peripherally at the time in the processing of a group of post-operation records. Another pause. Specifically the records from a classified operation conducted in 2004. Ethan felt his mother go still beside him, the record anomaly in your file, Reynolds. Bryce continued, the one that makes your service history appear as logistics rather than combat medicines. That anomaly was introduced during the 2006 processing period. I couldn't prove it. Then the data trail was clean enough to read as administrative error. Her voice tightened by a fraction. But administrative errors don't repeat themselves with the same field replacement 7 times across 7 different records. I said. He altered the records. I believe he did, Bryce said. I couldn't act on belief. Now I have a conduct investigation, a formal complaint that gives me grounds to pull the full access history from 2006, and an IG investigator who is currently requesting those records as we speak. A pause. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you walked into when your son filed that claim. Because I want you to understand that what happens next is not small. Silence stretched. How many records? Maya said. Her voice was the flattest Ethan had ever heard it. We don't know yet, Bryce said. We know yours. We're cross-referencing the 2006 batch. There were 41 records processed in that window from that operation. Said a beat. Was one of them 41? Ethan did the arithmetic without wanting to. 41. Veterans changed records, made to look like something less than what they were. And a man who had then, 6 years later, ended up behind a benefits counter where he could complete the work those altered records had started denying claims, dismissing documentation, using the false picture he'd helped create to shut people out of what they'd earned. He put himself there, Ethan said. He didn't mean to say it out loud. Farr said. He altered the records in 2006, Ethan said. And then he went to work at a benefits office where those records would come in. He looked at his mother. That's not a coincidence. Maya was looking at him. Her face was doing the thing it did when something landed that she was not going to let herself react to in the way it deserved. Because the way it deserved was more than the situation could currently contain. Bryce's voice came through the speaker again. That's the question the IG is now formally investigating. The rest of the afternoon moved in the particular suspended way that follows a revelation too large to fully absorb in real time. Ellen Whitmore came out at 3:30 to say James had been moved from critical to serious, that he was conscious, that he'd asked specifically whether the statement he'd intended to file was still going to happen, and when Farrar told him yes, it was still going to happen and that there was a larger investigation now, Ellen said James had closed his eyes and been quiet for a long time. And then he'd said good in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just learned the distance is shorter than they thought. Maya stepped outside at 4 o'clock. Ethan followed her. She was standing in the hospital's small exterior courtyard, one of those mandatory architectural features of large medical centers, a rectangle of concrete and dormant planters that nobody was using in October. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, and she was looking at nothing in particular. He won records, Ethan said. Yes. He changed your record so that your benefits claim would fail, Ethan said. If you ever filed one, which you didn't for years. Don't, she said. Don't do the math where you're responsible for uncovering this, she said, turning to face him. Because it goes the other way, too. If you hadn't filed, this would have stayed buried. And that's not something to feel good about, Ethan. 41 records. People who didn't get what they were owed because a man decided he could rewrite what they'd done. Her voice had moved into something rougher than usual. That's years. That's benefits people didn't receive. Medical support. They didn't get some of them. She stopped. He waited. Some of them are probably dead, she said. People who needed treatment and didn't get it because their records said they weren't eligible for the coverage. People who gave up. She turned back to the dormant planters. I don't know how to feel good about the fact that it took this long. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. The October air was cold enough to see their breath. You can't fix the time, he said finally, but you can fix what's next. That's what you always tell me, he said, when I mess something up. You don't go back over it. You figure out what's next. She looked at him sideways. The precursor expression. Gone before it became anything. I say that about homework, she said. The principle's the same. She exhaled slowly, and the breath moved in the cold air and dispersed, and she turned toward the door. "We need to get you home," she said, "and I need to call Okafor." He followed her inside, and they collected their things from the waiting room, and Farrar stayed behind with Ellen. And they drove back through the city as the afternoon moved into early evening, and the streetlights came on along the wet pavement, and Portland did its October thing with the mist and the flat sky. At 7:15, Okafor called. Ethan heard his mother's side again from across the kitchen while he was heating soup. The only thing in the cabinet that made sense tonight. He heard yes. How many? And then a pause. So long he turned around from the stove, and Maya was standing with the phone at her ear and her back to him, and her shoulders were doing something he hadn't seen them do before. Collapsed. Not defeated. Just different. The posture of someone receiving something they've needed to hear for a very long time and don't quite know what to do with it. She ended the call. She stood still for another moment, facing the cabinet. He said. She turned around. Her face was controlled in the way it always was, but the fissure from 2 days ago was wider now, something coming through it that was not sadness and not relief, but a complicated mixture of both that didn't have a clean name. Investigator, she said, pulled the 2006 access logs. Vail's credentials accessed 63 records in a 4-day window, she said. 41 of them were from the classified operation group. Only 2 of those field replacement consistencies changes that look like data entry errors, but follow a pattern. The same field, the same replacement category 22 times. The soup was boiling. He reached over and turned it off. Okafor says the IG is now treating it as deliberate record falsification, Maya said. It's no longer a conduct investigation, it's a criminal referral. Ethan went scrimmel. He said federal, Maya said. Intentional falsification of military records is a federal crime. It cares. She stopped. The penalties are significant. He looked at his mother in the kitchen, in the house on Caraway Street, in her faded scrubs and worn jacket. In the place she'd built quietly and without complaint, while the system that was supposed to honor what she'd done had been carrying a falsified version of her for 20 years. He said, Okafor thinks within the week, Maya said. G will refer, and then it goes to the JG office, and then she paused. And then it's not in our hands anymore. He nodded. He got 2 bowls from the cabinet and ladled the soup. She sat down without being asked. They ate in the specific silence of people who have said enough for one day, and know it, the kitchen warm against the cold outside the house, settling the way old houses do in the wind. He was almost done with his soup when his phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. Unknown number, he answered, a man's voice, not fair, not anyone he recognized. Oh. And quick, the voice of someone talking from a place they didn't want to be overheard. Yes. My name is Daniel Torres, the voice said. My wife, Carla Torres, was a Navy petty officer. Her benefits were denied 18 months ago. I've been trying to find someone who would listen for a year and a half. A pause. Someone gave me your number, they said. You were the reason this investigation started. A pause shorter. True. Ethan looked at his mother across the table. She was watching him, reading his face, doing what she did. Yes, he said. That's true. Then I need to tell you something, Daniel Torres said, that I don't think the investigators know yet. Something. My wife told me before she stopped. The stop had a specific quality to it, the kind that follows a word that was about to be died. Soup was getting cold, Mr. Torres, Ethan said carefully. Tell me. The silence on the phone lasted 3 seconds, which was long enough for Ethan to set down his spoon and push his bowl aside and give the call the full weight it was asking for. He said again. Take your time, a breath on the other end. The sound of someone's in a room, somewhere in the city, or outside the city, or somewhere else entirely. The call had no daguerreography to it, just a man's voice and the effort it was taking him to use it. Daughter died. 4 months ago, Daniel Torres said cervical cancer. Stage 3 when they found it, stage 4. 6 weeks later, he said it the way people say things. They've said so many times they've worn the emotion out of the words themselves, leaving just the shape of them. She had military medical coverage that should have covered the oncology costs. The kind of coverage that comes with her service classification. Her file listed her as a logistics specialist, supply coordination, non-combat, and the coverage tier for that classification doesn't include comprehensive oncology. Ethan felt the kitchen go cold around him. She served 12 years as a Navy intelligence analyst, Torres said. She ran signals intercept operations in 3 different theaters. That's not supply coordination. That's not logistics. His voice had found its edge now, not sharp with anger, but with the specific grief of someone who has been angry. For so long it has become a structural part of how he holds himself upright. When she filed for the medical coverage, they pulled her record, said logistics. They denied the oncology coverage. We paid out of pocket for 3 months, and then we couldn't anymore, and she went on a reduced treatment protocol because it was what we could afford, and mine stopped. Ethan's hand on the phone was very still. When did her record get changed? He said it came out quieter than he intended. I don't know exactly, Torres said. I didn't know it had been changed until 2 days ago when someone from the Ridgeway group called and told me there was an investigation. That's when I pulled everything. I found the original service certification. She'd kept a physical copy. Carla kept physical copies of everything. She was meticulous, and I compared it to what the military database currently shows. A pause. They're not the same document. Ethan looked at his mother across the table. Maya was watching him, with the expression that preceded full stillness the moment before she made a decision, when all the inputs were arriving and being sorted. He put the call on Mr. Torres, he said. My mother is here. Maya Reynolds. Her record was altered the same way. A pause. I know who she is, Torres said. The person who gave me your number told me. She said your mother was the one who started this moving. Maya, said Mr. Torres. The physical copy your wife kept, is it somewhere safe? My hand right now, he said. Don't photograph it, she said. Email it. Don't put it anywhere digital tonight. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. Can you get to Portland? A pause. I'm in Beaverton, 8 minutes away. Come here, Maya said. She looked at Ethan and he nodded, and she gave Torres the address on Caraway Street, and the call ended, and the kitchen was very quiet for a moment. And then Maya stood up and cleared both bowls from the table and rinsed them at the sink without saying anything. Torres died. Because her coverage was denied, Ethan said. Yes. Because her record was changed. Yes. She turned off the tap. She stood at the sink with her back to him, hands on the edge of the counter, and he could see the tension in her shoulders that she wasn't going to say out loud. I know, she said. It's not a benefits dispute anymore. No, she said, it isn't. She turned around. Her face was doing the controlled thing, but the fissure had gone deeper. Whatever was behind it was pressing forward, and she was not quite stopping it anymore, just slowing it. Mom died because she couldn't access medical coverage she earned. Because someone changed the record that determined what she was eligible for. She said it the way you say something when you're making yourself hear the full weight of it out loud. That's not administrative misconduct. That's not a federal falsification charge. She looked at him directly. That's something else. He held her gaze. What do you need me to do? She looked at the table, then back at him. Call Okafor, she said. Got her. Torres is coming. Tell her about the physical copy. She picked up her own phone. I'm calling Bryce, he called Okafor. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant the investigation had already been keeping her up. When he told her about Torres, about the physical copy, about Carla Torres, and the denied oncology coverage and the reduced treatment protocol in stage 4 and 4 months ago, was quiet for long enough that he thought the call had dropped. You still there, he said. I'm here, Okafor said. Her voice was different from what it had been in the kitchen 2 days ago. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that sounded like what happened to professional composure when it met something it hadn't accounted for. Until he arrives 20 minutes, maybe. I'll be there in 30, she said. Don't let him leave. Daniel Torres arrived first. He was a compact man, early 50s, with the look of someone who had recently lost weight in the way that grief produces, not intentional, not healthy, just the body quietly reducing itself when maintenance stops feeling relevant. He had a manila envelope in his hand, the old-fashioned kind with the metal clasp, and he held it the way people hold things that are the last physical evidence of something irreplaceable. Ethan opened the door. Torres looked at him for a moment. Because you're the kid. I'm Ethan. Torres nodded. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table without being asked, which told Ethan something about the kind of man he was. Not impolite, just past the point where pleasantries felt like they fit into the available space. Maya sat across from him. Ethan sat at the end. Torres set the envelope on the table but kept his hand on it. I used to say that the paperwork was the armor, he said. Not to anyone in particular. In the Navy, you keep your paperwork, she said, because someday someone will try to tell you that something happened differently than it happened, and the paperwork is the only thing that doesn't forget. He looked at the envelope. She kept everything, every form, every certification, every evaluation. She had a filing system for it, color-coded. Something crossed his face, brief and unguarded. I used to give her a hard time about it. The kitchen was quiet. She was right, he said. She was right, and I'm sitting here with the proof of it. And she's not here to... He stopped himself. I said. She's not here, Maya said. Can I see it? He slid the envelope across the table. She opened the clasp carefully and removed the documents inside, maybe 8 pages, printed on the slightly different paper stock of an older printer. The colors of official stamps faded with age but legible lines. She looked at the first page the second. She went, still on the third. Touched her face. This is her original service classification, Maya said. She set the page down and turned it so Torres could see it. The intelligence specialist. Grade 7 signals intercept operations. Secondary designation. Tactical analyst classified theater. She looked up at Torres. This is a Tier 2 classification, I know, Torres said. Tier 2 military intelligence analysts are eligible for comprehensive medical coverage under the Extended Service Healthcare Act, Maya said, including oncology. She set the page down flat on the table very precisely, the way you set something down when you need your hands to not be doing anything while you think. Does her current database record list. Logistics coordination specialist, Torres said. E5 2 grades lower, completely different, occupational specialty. Coverage tier. Ethan looked at the page, then at Torres. When was Carla at Fort Callan? He said. Torres looked at him. She was never at Fort Callan. When did she separate from service? Then 8. Was she part of any operation group that processed records in 2006? Ethan said. Oz frowned. She was still active in 2006. She was deployed. He paused. Because the records we've identified so far were altered during a 2006 processing window at Fort Callan, Ethan said. If Carla was still active and deployed in 2000s, Maya looked up. She'd gotten there the same place half a second faster. Records would have been processed at a different point, she said. Not Fort Callan, not 2006. She looked at Torres. When did Carla separate? August 2008, Torres said. Honorable discharge. She had the ceremony and everything. Operation. Records are processed through a central terminal, Maya said. The separation package goes through one classification review before final filing. She looked at Ethan. It's a different access window, which means Ethan started. Which means the 2006 Fort Callan window isn't the only one, Maya said. The front door opened. Uffer came in without knocking. Maya must have left it unlocked, carrying her leather portfolio and wearing the look of someone who had driven 25 miles per hour over the speed limit. She took in the table the documents. Tomi, she said. Maya handed her the pages. Okafor read them standing up, which told Ethan she'd already decided this was important before she saw them. And she got to the third page. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and sat down. What's the separation processing terminal for Navy personnel discharged in 2008, Ethan said to her. Okafor looked up Naval Personnel Command, she said. Yankton, Tennessee. She looked at the pages again. That's a different access system from Fort Callan's personnel database. Can the same credentials reach both, Ethan said. Legitimately, Okafor said. But if someone had cross-system access authorized during a specific duty period, they might retain ghost credentials. Access that was technically revoked but not fully scrubbed from the secondary system. The kitchen had taken on the quality of a room where something important was being assembled from parts that had been scattered too far apart to see as a whole until now. Was at Fort Callan through mid-2007, Maya said. If his credentials weren't fully scrubbed when he transferred, he could have accessed Navy Personnel Command through a legacy authentication pathway, Okafor said. She was already reaching for her phone in 2008, after he'd technically left. Which would mean the alterations aren't limited to the 2006 batch, Ethan said. Okafor looked at him with the re-evaluating expression she'd used before, the one that recategorized him slightly each time. It means we don't know the actual scope yet, she said. She was dialing. I need to call the IG tonight. Right now, she stood up. Move. Don't do anything with those documents until I'm off the phone. She went into the hallway. Torres was looking at the pages on the table. How many people, he said. We don't know yet, Maya said. How many like Carla, he said. He said it without looking up. How many people needed medical coverage they earned and couldn't get it because of what he did to their records? It's my flat. He stopped. He put both hands flat on the table. He was a man who was keeping himself in one piece through an act of sustained will, and it was visible, the seams of it. We don't know yet, Maya said again, more quietly this time. Oz nodded. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, she never blamed anyone. Not once. When the coverage was denied, she said there must be an error. We'll fix it. We'll reapply. Even when the reapplication was denied, she said, we'll find another way. He looked up from the table. Eyes were dry. But the effort of that was its own statement. Eyes. She spent the last 6 weeks of her life filling out paperwork trying to fix it. Knife. The hallway was quiet from where Ethan sat. He could hear Okafor's voice, low and rapid, the specific cadence of someone conveying information that changes the shape of what someone else thought they were dealing with. Maya reached across the table and put her hand over Torres's hand. Not for long. Just a moment, just enough, then she withdrew it. Yes, she was right to keep the documents, Maya said. What she kept is going to matter. F looked at her. He nodded once, the nod of someone who needed to believe that and did, and wasn't sure if it was enough, but was taking it. Okafor came back into the kitchen. The IG investigator is calling the Naval Personnel Command Security Office tonight, she said. They're going to pull the full access log for the separation processing terminal for 2007 through 2009. She sat down. If Vail's credentials touch that system, it'll show wrong, Maya said. She said 72 hours. It'd be faster. Okafor looked at Torres. Your wife's documents are going to be central to this. IG will want the originals. I know, Torres said. That's why I came. I need to take them tonight, Okafor said. I'll give you a receipt, and they'll be logged as evidence. First thing tomorrow. Torres looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at it the way you look at something that has been yours, that has meant something specific, and is now going to move into the world and mean something else. And larger, maybe, but different. He slid it across to Okafor. Take good care of it, I will, she said. And she meant it, which was the right way to receive what he'd just given. The next 72 hours had the quality of held breath. Ethan went to school because his mother told him to, and because there was nothing useful he could do at home that waiting rooms and phone calls required him for, and because the ordinary mechanics of a school day, the noise of it, the smallness of the problems, the specific collective energy of 200 teenagers who knew nothing about what was happening in a kitchen on Caraway Street, were unexpectedly a relief. He sat in his classes and took his notes and ate his lunch and answered when people talked to him, and underneath all of it was the persistent low-frequency hum of something large moving. The way you feel the engine of a ship through the floor of it before you hear anything. James Whitmore was moved from serious to stable on the second day. And Farrer called to tell them, and Ethan heard his mother exhale when she got off the phone in a way that was the closest thing to an audible release of tension he'd ever heard from her. On the third morning, Okafor called at 7:51. Ethan was in the kitchen, Maya answered, and put it on speaker without being asked, which told him she'd been waiting for this with the same held breath quality and had decided he'd earned the right to hear it in real time. My Naval Personnel Command confirmed it, Okafor said. Vail's credentials accessed. The separation processing terminal 14 times between November 2007 and March 2009. He'd been transferred out of Fort Callan in July 2007. Access to that system should have been revoked. A pause. Wasn't. Maya's hand on the table was still, how many records were accessed, she said. They're still counting, Ofer said. What they can confirm right now is 37 access events tied to specific personnel files. Of those 19 show field alterations matching the same pattern as the Fort Callan batch. Another pause. Combined with the 22 from Fort Callan, that's 41 confirmed altered records across 2 access windows. Amber had come full circle 41, the same number Bryce had given them for the Fort Callan batch. But that wasn't the Fort Callan batch alone anymore. It was 2 separate systems, 2 separate periods. The same credentials, the same field replacement, the same man. J office has been notified, Okafor said. The criminal referral from the IG went through last night. It's no longer an investigation, it's a prosecution. Said. What charges intentional falsification of military service records? Okafor said. Multiple counts. Unauthorized access to a protected federal database. And she paused with the specific weight of someone who has saved the heaviest thing for last. Is looking at a supplemental charge related to consequential harm. Carla Torres. Case specifically, what does that mean? Ethan said. It means they're examining whether the falsification of her record directly caused the denial of medical coverage that affected her treatment and outcome, Okafor said. It's a complex legal thread, and I won't tell you it's certain, but they're pulling it, talking at it. The kitchen was quiet. He's going to prison, Ethan said. It came out not like a question and not like satisfaction and not like relief. It came out like a fact, the kind that takes a moment to become real after you've said it. The prosecution will determine that, Okafor said carefully. But the evidence is it's comprehensive, and the JG office doesn't open a criminal referral of this scope without significant confidence. After the call ended, Ethan and Maya sat at the kitchen table for a while without talking. The morning light came through the window it always did. The same angle, the same quality, and the house was exactly what it had always been rented. A little worn, exactly theirs. And Ethan sat in it with the strange feeling of the world having rearranged itself significantly while the kitchen remained entirely the same. What happens to the 41 records? He said. They'll be corrected, Maya said. Finally. Each one reviewed, the original classification restored, the benefits recalculated. She was holding her coffee mug in both hands, but not drinking it. For some of them it'll mean back payments. For some it'll mean coverage reinstated going forward. And for the people who needed coverage that they didn't get, Ethan said. She didn't answer that for a moment. For some of them, it'll be too late, she said. And that is the part that doesn't go away. She set the mug down. Justice and repair are not the same thing. Sometimes you get one without the other. At her, does that make it not worth doing? At his eyes. No, she said, it makes it necessary and insufficient at the same time. Those things can both be true, he thought about that. He would keep thinking about it. On the fourth day, Marcus Vail's attorney filed a motion to have the criminal referral suspended pending review of the counter-complaint. The harassment allegation, the intimidation claim, the envelope delivered under duress. The motion was reviewed by the JG office in 4 hours and denied in writing, with a document that Okafor described over the phone as direct and that Farrar, who apparently read it, described as the judicial equivalent of a door closing on someone's foot. Vail's commanding officer, the CO, who had been cooperative from the beginning and was now, it appeared, highly motivated to remain so, issued a formal statement of separation from Vail's conduct, which was the institutional version of making sure everyone understood whose ship this was not going to sink with. The administrative hold on Vail's position became a formal suspension with pay pending charges. His attorney issued a statement claiming cooperation and expressing confidence in the process, which was what attorneys said when they were not confident in the process. On the fifth day, the Naval Inspector General's office released a preliminary findings report, public, but Okafor had a copy, and she came to the house on Caraway Street in the early evening and sat at the kitchen table that had become the unofficial operations center of something none of them had planned to be running, and she read the relevant sections aloud. Systematic misuse of restricted database access. Pattern of deliberate field replacement in service records. 22. Confirmed falsifications from the Fort Callan access window. 18. Confirmed from the Naval Personnel Command access window. 41 individual military service records materially altered in ways that affected benefits eligibility, medical coverage determination, and service classification status. 7. Complaints against Vail at the Raven Creek Benefits Office previously dismissed, now re-evaluated in light of the falsification findings and determined to reflect a continuation of the same pattern of deliberate harm. 5. 3 cases from the Benefits Office, Reynolds, Whitmore, Torres, elevated as primary references in the criminal referral. Okafor, who was also at the table, because Okafor had called him too, was looking at the folder with an expression that was more complicated than any single emotion. They're calling it a pattern of deliberate harm, he said. Yes, Okafor said, across years, he said.
Did the cross year?
Yes. Torres was quiet for a moment, then Carla's record will be corrected. It's already in process, Okafor said. Her file will be restored to the original Tier 2 classification. Medical coverage determination will be retroactively corrected. She paused. There will be a formal finding that she was owed comprehensive oncology coverage that was wrongfully denied. It was not enough. Everyone at the table knew it was not enough. It was also the most that could be given, and Torres received it with the complicated dignity of a man who understood both of those things simultaneously and had no interest in pretending otherwise. Thank you, he said to Okafor, to Maya, to the room. Maya nodded. Ethan looked at the table. He thought about Carla Torres filling out paperwork in the last 6 weeks of Rolf, color-coded filing systems, the armor of documentation, a woman who kept the physical copy, because she knew that someday someone would try to tell her something happened differently than it happened. He thought about James Whitmore, still in a hospital bed, 2 miles away, stabilized, stubborn, asking whether his statement was still going to matter. He thought about the waiting room at Raven Creek, the older man with the VFW pin who had stood up, sound of 20-plus dogs in formation coming down the hallway. A stamp sounds on a form. He thought about his mother at 3 in the morning in the kitchen. Then Okafor said something that pulled him back into the room. There's one more thing in the preliminary findings, she said. She had opened the folder again and was looking at a page near the back. IG identified a 4th case. They're adding to the primary reference group. A veteran. whose record was altered in the Naval Personnel Command window in 2008. She looked at Maya, on a man named Sergeant First Class Howard Briggs, retired Army medical specialist. His file was altered from Combat MiG Tier 3 to Supply Specialist. She paused. He died in 2021. His family has been trying to access survivor benefits based on his service classification for the past 3 years. They've been denied 3 times. The kitchen was quiet. Family's going to need a lawyer, Ethan said. I'm going to get one, Okafor said. The JG office is assigning advocate counsel to all affected parties. Maya was looking at the folder. Her expression had crossed from the controlled register into something that was not quite the fissure anymore. The fissure had opened into something wider, something that didn't have a wall in front of it the same way. Not grief. Exactly. The kind of anger that comes out the other side of grief and becomes something else. Full directed. I want to see the complete list, she said. Okafor looked at her. The 41 names, Maya said. I want to see all of them. She looked at Okafor steadily. Not to do anything with them. Not to interfere with the investigation. I just want to know who they are. A pause. I served with some of them. I might not know it yet. I want to know. Okafor held her gaze for a long moment. Then she reached into the portfolio and removed a single page, not the folder, a separate page, and set it on the table face down. This is not an official document, she said carefully. This is a working reference list that a colleague shared with me. It has not been formally released. She left her hand on it for a moment. I was never here with this. She lifted her hand. I turned it over. Ethan watched his mother's eyes down the page. He watched the controlled expression, the professional stillness, the face he'd been learning to read in new ways over the past 5 days. He watched her reach the bottom of the list and go still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. She set the page down. She pointed to a name near the middle of the second column. I know him, she said. Her voice was even. But it was the even of something that had been recently quieted rather than something naturally still. He was the team leader for the 2004 operation. He was one of the 3 who came home. She looked at Ethan. He's been trying to access his medical benefits for 7 years. Ethan looked at the name, then he looked at his mother. Then he said the thing he'd been not quite saying, since the car ride home 5 days ago, the thing that had been forming in the accumulating folder of understood but not spoken things. He's going to find out, Ethan said, when his record is corrected. When the investigation goes public, he's going to know what happened. Maya said. Does he know you're involved in this? She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. He doesn't know I'm in Portland. He doesn't know any of it. Are you going to tell him? Maya looked at the page on the table. She looked at the name in the second column. She looked at it for a long moment, and the kitchen held its breath around her, and her phone rang. Not Okafor. Okafor was right there. Not Ferrer. The screen said a number she hadn't stored under a name. A number she clearly recognized anyway, because her expression changed when she saw it. Not dramatically, but enough. She looked at Ethan. It's him, she answered on the second ring. Reynolds, she said, same as always. Same word, same register, the one-word answer that gave nothing away until she decided what to give. The voice on the other end was a man's lower than Ethan had imagined, with the specific quality of a voice that had once given orders and still carried that shape even when it wasn't giving them. He couldn't hear the words, just the tone, and the tone was careful. The tone of someone who has picked up a phone, knowing that the conversation they're about to have has been overdue for a long time. Maya listened for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, I know, I saw the list tonight. A pause. I'm in Portland. Another pause. Yes. A longer pause. Not tonight, tomorrow. She glanced at Ethan, then away. Bring the folder you kept from 2004, the physical one. A pause. No, you still have it. You kept everything, same as me. She ended the call. The kitchen held the moment. His name is Raymond Osei, she said. He was staff sergeant, first in the door on every operation we ran together for 2 years. She set the phone face down on the table. He drove down when he heard about the investigation. He's been sitting in a hotel in Tualatin for two days trying to figure out if he should call me. Why didn't he call sooner? Ethan said. Because he wasn't sure I'd want to hear from him, she said. She said it without elaboration, which meant the elaboration was in a room he didn't have the key to yet. We didn't separate on bad terms, we just separated. People do that. After something like 2004, sometimes the only way to keep moving is to not look back at the people who were there with you. She stood up, looked back. Okafor gathered her portfolio quietly and said she'd be in touch first thing in the morning, and Torres said goodnight with the exhausted steadiness of a man who had emptied himself out tonight and needed to refill before the next thing. Offer had gone hours ago. And then it was just the kitchen, just Ethan and Maya, just the house settling around them in the way it did. Like, what was he like? Ethan said. "OC." Maya thought about it, which told him she was going to give him the honest version rather than the summary. "Stubborn," she said, "more stubborn than you. And that's a category I didn't think had room in it, a beat. Careful." He was careful the way people are careful when they've learned that carelessness costs something specific. She was quiet for a moment. He carried the whole team, not just in the field. After, he was the one who called the families, every family. 5. He insisted on doing it himself. She paused. 9 calls. 5. Ethan did the arithmetic again, the way he kept doing it. People. 3 came home. 9 calls. "I'll go to bed," he said. "Hi," she said. He was at the doorway when she said his name. Ethan. His name, the way she said it when she meant something specific by it, the version with weight in it. "Hi." He turned around. "What you did," she said, "for filing that claim. 5. Going in there without knowing what you were walking into. 5. Sitting in front of a man who was trying to make you feel small and not moving." She was looking at him directly, fully. The way she looked at things, she was deciding to commit to memory. "I need you to understand that it mattered, not just to me. Like the 41 names on that list. You started the chain that's going to fix what happened to them." She paused. "Nice. You didn't know that. You were trying to help with the bills." "I was," he said. "I know." She turned back to the sink. Asleep. He went upstairs. He lay in his room for a while and did not sleep, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than it had been the previous nights, less anxious, more like sitting with something large and slowly becoming accustomed to its dimensions. Raymond O.C. arrived at the house on Caraway Street at 10 the next morning in a truck that had accumulated the specific kind of road wear that came from years of being used rather than kept, and he was a big man wide through the shoulders, with close-cropped hair, gone silver at the temples, and a face that had the structural quality of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors in conditions that required the face to remain neutral, regardless of what was happening. He had a folder under his arm, physical thick, the kind of folder that has been opened and closed enough times that the covers have developed a soft bend. He and Maya looked at each other on the front porch for a moment that Ethan watched from the window inside and understood was not his to be part of yet. They didn't embrace, they did something that was in its way more significant. They stood in the same space with the full weight of what they both knew between them, and neither of them flinched from it. Then Maya said something too low to hear, and O.C. nodded, and they came inside. O.C. looked at Ethan and said, "You look like her." "Shaw." "People say that," Ethan said. "It's not a complaint," O.C. said. He set the folder on the kitchen table and sat down with the ease of a man whose body knew how to be still and how to be ready, and had stopped wasting energy on the difference between those two states a long time ago. "Your mother tells me you put together the original benefits file." "Yes, you'd never seen her service record." "No." "Nice." O.C. looked at him for a moment, assessing without performing the assessment. "I held it anyway," he said. "I knew she served," Ethan said. I knew what I could see, the bag, the instruments. It's the way she moves. The thing she does at 3 in the morning." He met O.C.'s eyes. "She never lied to me. I figured the record was the thing that was wrong, not her." O.C. was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Maya, and something passed between them that had the quality of an old communication, the shorthand of people who had once needed to understand each other faster than words allowed. "Kid," he said. "He has his moments." Maya said, a dry tone that was. Ethan had come to understand, like its own form of profound approval. They spread O.C.'s documents on the table alongside the copies Okafor had left. Its folder was as Maya had predicted, complete evaluations, operation logs, and the portions that weren't classified medical records. His original service classification as Staff Sergeant, Tier 3, Combat Specialist, with secondary designation as Tactical Team Leader for Special Operations Units. His current database record, pulled from the Naval Personnel Command System and printed by the IG investigator, listed him as a Supply Logistics Coordinator, Tier 1. 7 years of trying to access benefits under a classification that had been stripped from him without his knowledge and replaced with something that bore no relationship to what he'd actually done for 22 years. "I thought I was losing my mind," O.C. said. He wasn't looking at the documents. He was looking at the table, the first 2 denials. "I thought I'd made errors in the application. I went back through everything. I resubmitted 3rd denial. They told me my record clearly showed a logistics background, and I wasn't eligible for the coverage I was claiming." He paused. "I spent a year thinking maybe I'd misremembered. Maybe I'd gotten confused about what I'd actually done." He looked up. 22 years. "I thought maybe I'd gotten confused about 22 years. The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. You hadn't, Maya said. I know that now, he said. But I didn't know it then. And that he stopped. His jaw moved slightly. That's the thing that's hard to explain to people who haven't had it happen. He didn't just change the record. He changed what I could trust about my own memory. That's a specific kind of damage. Ethan thought about the waiting room. The man with the TBI from Kandahar, who'd been told his diagnosis didn't meet the threshold. Carla Torres, filling out forms at the end of her life. The specific architecture of what Vail had done, not just the falsification, not just the denials, but the second phase effect of making people question the reality of their own experience. That was the cruelest part of it. The records weren't just paperwork. They were the official account of what a person had done and survived. Change the record and you change the story. Change the story enough, and people start to wonder if the story was ever true. Okafor arrived at 11 with Agent Rachel Sutton from the IG office, who had driven up from the federal building with the particular purposeful energy of an investigator who had spent the previous 72 hours in an accelerating case and was now arriving at she clearly understood to be a significant junction. She was brief, professional, and asked OC to walk through the timeline of his benefits denials with the same systematic patience she'd used in the conference room with Maya. Ethan sat in the hallway and listened. At 12:30, Sutton stepped out to make a call. She was on the phone for 11 minutes. When she came back, she sat back down at the table and said, "The JG office has added Sergeant OC's case to the primary reference group. Record is being formally flagged for correction today." OC looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a long time. "How long does correction take?" he said. "The formal restoration of the original classification will be processed within 5 business days," Sutton said. "Benefits. Recalculation and back assessment will follow within 30. She paused. "There will be a formal finding letter documenting the falsification and its impact on your eligibility. You'll receive that in writing," OC nodded. He was a man who had spent years maintaining composure because the alternative was too expensive, and the composure was holding that. But Ethan could see the seams of it in the way his hands were resting on the table, flat, pressing down slightly, grounding himself. "Years," he said. "Yes," Sutton said. He nodded again. That was all. 4 days later, Marcus Vail was formally charged. Okafor called at 8 in the morning, and Ethan answered because his mother was in the shower, and Okafor gave him the list of charges, the way she gave him all information specifically, without embellishment, trusting him to receive it as an adult, because he'd been acting as one. 41 counts of intentional falsification of federal military service records. 2 counts of unauthorized access to a protected federal database system. 1 count of conduct, resulting in material harm. The charge tied to Carla Torres, the most difficult to prosecute and the most important to try. The counter-complaint against Maya, the harassment allegation, the intimidation claim, the envelope delivered under duress, had been formally dismissed by the IG evaluation team 8 days in, buried under the weight of witness statements from 7 people who had been in the waiting room that morning, including the man with the VFW pin, whose name turned out to be Gerald Pruitt, who was 81 years old and had served in Vietnam and had apparently given his statement to the investigator with the specific eloquence of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask. Vail's attorney released a statement through a law firm letterhead expressing his client's intention to cooperate with the legal process. The statement used the word context 4 times and the word discretion twice, which told Ethan something about the defense strategy without knowing anything about law. His commanding officer issued a formal press statement distancing the Naval Medical Center from Vail's conduct and expressing support for the investigation. The CO had in the past week become very publicly cooperative in a way that had the specific quality of a man building a wall between himself and a fire. James Whitmore was discharged from Providence Medical Center that same afternoon, which felt like the universe's sense of timing, imperfect but not entirely indifferent. Farrar drove him home. Ethan and Maya met them at Whitmore's apartment in northeast Portland because Ellen had called and asked if they would, which was its own kind of thing. A woman who had sat in a hospital for 9 days, asking if they would come and be there when her husband came home, as if their presence meant something specific that she wanted present for the moment. Whitmore was thinner than Ethan had expected, not that he'd had a clear image, but this man looked like someone who had recently been hollowed out slightly and had not yet fully refilled. He walked with a cane he clearly resented, based on the way he held it functional, but at a slight angle from his body, like he was maintaining a professional disagreement with it. He looked at Maya when he came through the door. "Reynolds," he said. "More," she said. They told me your kid started this whole thing, he said. Why? He filed a benefits claim, she said. That's what I said. He looked at Ethan with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who had lost the capacity for social indirection sometime around his third surgery. Thank you, he said. Ethan said I was trying to help with the bills. Whitmore looked at him for another moment. Then something shifted in his face, not a smile, but the structural precursor to one, the movement before the movement. Science. Sure you were, he said, and went to sit down with the careful pace of a man who had recently been told to take things carefully and was going to do exactly that much compliance and no more. Athens. Ellen had made coffee and something that involved a casserole dish, and they sat in the living room for 2 hours. Whitmore, Ellen, Maya, Ethan, Farrar, and the Malinois, and Osi, who had driven down from his hotel in Tualatin because Farrar had called and told him to come, and the conversation moved away. Conversations move when the people having them have been through something together without having planned to, covering practical things and quiet things, and occasionally nothing at all in a way that felt like all of them breathing in the same room and finding it sufficient. I called during that time. He was not there in person. He was home in Beaverton, where he was most nights now in the house he and Carla had shared doing the work of being alone in it. He asked Farrar about Whitmore, and Farrar handed the phone to Whitmore, and the two men talked for a few minutes with the specific economy of men who don't know each other well, but share a category of experience that makes introduction unnecessary. When the call ended, Whitmore handed the phone back and sat with it for a moment. Life's record is going to be corrected, he said. Not a question, confirming. Yes, Maya said, the coverage that was denied. There'll be a formal finding, Maya said. It won't She stopped. Lost words. It won't change what happened, but it'll be on record. She was owed what she should have had. Whitmore looked at his hands. Not enough, he said. No, Maya said, it isn't. But it's something. Yes, she said, it's something. Fine. He nodded. The Malinois had relocated at some point during the afternoon and was now sitting next to Whitmore's chair, not demanding anything, just present. And Whitmore had his hand resting on the dog's head without appearing to have made a deliberate decision to put it there. The formal charging hearing for Marcus Vail was held on a Thursday morning at the federal courthouse in downtown Portland, and it was not the dramatic public spectacle that Ethan had half imagined in the less rational parts of his thinking. It was a federal proceeding, which meant it was precise and procedural, and moved with the specific unhurried authority of a system that had decided what it was going to do and was now doing it. And Maya sat in the public gallery with Okafor and Farrar. He was there. Torres was there in the back row, wearing the suit that still fit him from before. Harold Pruitt, 81 years old and VFW pin in place, was in the third row, sitting with a younger man who was clearly his son, and who had taken the morning off work to drive his father downtown. Entered with his attorney, and sat at the defense table in civilian clothes. A dark, specific too-hard, the specific look of someone who had been told to appear cooperative and trustworthy, and was working hard at both. Without the uniform, he looked like a man, which was the right size for him. He looked at the gallery once, the way people look at rooms they're entering, and his gaze passed over the row where Ethan and Maya sat and continued without stopping, either because he was disciplined enough not to react, or because he had, ever processing he'd done over the past 2 weeks, moved into a different mode of self-preservation. Charges were read 41 counts, 2 counts, 1 count. The legal language turned what Ethan knew into something formal and permanent, each charge a specific shape of what had been done translated into the language that made it answerable. Kyle's attorney entered a plea of not guilty on all counts, which was procedurally expected, and said nothing about what anyone in the room understood to be true. A woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the demeanor of someone who had heard a great many things in this room, and was not easily surprised, scheduled the preliminary hearing and issued a series of conditions. Access to all federal database systems had already been revoked. His security clearance, suspended during the investigation, was now formally rescinded pending resolution of the criminal charges. His position at Raven Creek Naval Medical Center Benefits Administration was, for all practical purposes, over. The CO had moved quickly enough on that to make the formal designation almost redundant. The hearing took 45 minutes. When it was done, they filed out into the October morning. It was still October, Ethan realized. Month had stretched to contain more than it usually held, and stood on the courthouse steps in the specific way that groups of people stand when they've been through something together and aren't quite ready to disperse. Was next to Ethan on the steps. He was looking at the city, the way the morning light sat on the buildings across the street. Is it what you expected? Ethan said. Torres thought about it. Oh. He said, I expected it to feel bigger. He paused. Like, it just feels correct, like something going back to the position it should have been in. He was quiet for a moment. Like, which is maybe what justice actually feels like, not big. Right. Just right, Ethan held that. He thought he'd remember it. 5. The formal record corrections for all 41 veterans began processing over the following 2 weeks, and Maya's was among the first. She received a letter in a plain government envelope, ironically plain given everything that documented the restoration of her original service classification. Combat Medic Tier 3, Special Operations Attachment Service, dates 2001 through 2009. Decorated. The decoration had been in the original file too, apparently tucked in a field that the falsification hadn't touched, because it wasn't tied to benefits eligibility. She read the letter at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, and set it down when she was done and looked at the wall for a moment. Watched her from across the table. How does it feel? He said. She considered the question with the honesty she'd been giving things lately, the version that didn't shortcut to the acceptable answer. Overdue, she said. It feels like something I should have had a long time ago and didn't. And now I do, and I'm glad, and I'm also aware of all the time between then and now that doesn't get handed back. She looked at the letter. 5. Both of those things are true at once. I've been doing that a lot lately. Holding 2 things at once since when, he said. Looked at him. Since you made me open the closet, she said. He hadn't made her open the closet, she'd opened it herself. But he understood what she meant, and he didn't correct it. The debrief process. The formal completion of what she'd walked away from in the months after 2004 took 3 sessions with an IG-assigned clinical debriefer and 1 session with Admiral Bryce's office directly. Ethan didn't know the details of what was said in those rooms and didn't ask for them, because some rooms belonged entirely to the person who had to be in them. And his job was to make sure there was soup on the stove and the kitchen was lit when she came home. She came home from the 3rd session and sat down at the table, and he put food in front of her and she ate it, and then she said, it's done. Okay. He said, all of it, she said, formally closed. She looked at him. The 2004 file is complete. The debrief is complete. Everything that was open is closed. He nodded. I didn't think it would feel like anything particular, she said. But it does. Like what? She thought about it for a long time, long enough, that he thought she'd decided not to answer. And like putting something down that I'd been carrying for so long, I stopped noticing the weight of it. And now I'm standing without it, and I kept reaching for it, and it's not there. She paused. Nice. It's strange. Not bad, just strange. I have to learn how to stand differently. He didn't say anything. He refilled her water glass. Came back to Portland the week after the charging hearing, not to meet with lawyers or investigators, but to some 2 days just being in the city. And he and Maya walked for hours. Both days Ethan knew this, because she came home with the specific long walking produces rather than the different tiredness of difficult conversation, and she smelled like outdoor air. She didn't tell him what they talked about, and he didn't ask. On the 2nd evening, O.C. came to the house for dinner, and Ethan made pasta because it was the thing he could make that didn't come from a can, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table and ate, and O.C. talked about Seattle with the wry, specific affection of someone who has complicated feelings about a place and has made peace with the complication. He talked about the handler he knew up there who ran a canine training program for veterans transitioning out of service, and how he'd been volunteering there the past 2 years, and how the dogs didn't care what your record. Said they assessed you entirely on what you did in front of them, which was, he said, both simple and demanding in the exact right proportions. You should come up sometime, he said to Ethan, see the program. Like that, Ethan said. O.C. looked at Maya. She was eating her pasta with the focused economy that meant she'd forgotten to eat earlier in the day. He watched her for a moment with the expression of someone who has known another person long enough to read the small signs and has not lost the ability to do so even after years of not seeing them. You look better than when I last saw you, he said. Saw me. When I was covered in blood in a transport vehicle, she said. I know, he said, you look better. She looked at him sideways. The precursor expression older, she said. Better, he said. And he meant it as the exact thing. It was not a compliment about appearance, but an observation about the citrism, who had across the years between then and now become more fully whatever they were always supposed to be. I looked at her pasta. Yeah, she said quietly. Maybe the question of what came next arrived, as most real questions do, not in a dramatic moment, but in the quiet space between things. As benefits, formally recalculated under the corrected classification, came with back assessment for 8 years of differential between what she'd received under the falsified record and what she'd been owed under the real one. It was not a life-changing number in the way that phrase usually gets used, but it was enough to matter, enough to make the double shifts optional rather than mandatory. Enough to consider what she might want to do with time that was hers rather than the clinic's. She sat with the number for 3 days before she talked about it, which was how she sat with most things, and then she said, Okafor mentioned that the Ridgeway group needs a medical coordinator. Someone with actual clinical experience who can develop protocols for the dogs and the handlers. She said it not looking at him, which was how she floated things she was actually considering. Time. It'd mean keeping my clinic hours, but reducing them. Do you want to do it? Ethan said. I don't know yet, she said. I'm still figuring out what I want, which is she paused. New. That's a new problem to have. He thought that was a remarkable thing to say. He thought he'd remember that too. You should do it, he said. The Ridgeway thing, if you want it. I didn't ask for your opinion, she said. I know, he said. You've got it anyway. She looked at him with the full version of the expression that had been a precursor for 5 years and finally landed as what it actually was, the face of a woman who found her son genuinely funny and was not always going to pretend otherwise. When did you get this confident? She said. I filed a military benefits claim in October, he said. It kind of opened some doors. She shook her head, but the expression stayed. Go do your homework, she said. The thing about the way a story like this lands, the thing that doesn't make it into the official record or the investigation findings or the charging documents, is the texture of the ordinary days after. The clinic on Tuesday, where Maya worked her shift the same as always, except that she'd taken on the Ridgeway coordination work, and her phone had a different kind of call on it now. Sometimes the kind that was about protocols and training schedules, and which dogs needed which specific assessments, and she handled those calls in the parking lot before her shift with the focused efficiency of someone who has found second use for a skill they'd been only partially using. The Saturday morning when Ethan went with Farrar and 3 of the Ridgeway dogs to the park along the river, because Farrar said the dogs needed open ground and Ethan said he had nothing better to do. And they walked for 2 hours along the water in the November cold and talked about nothing important and everything real, the way conversations work when the stakes are temporarily off and 2 people can just be present in the same place. The phone call from Torres in December, not about the case. The case had its own channels, its own timeline, its own process. Moving forward without requiring his daily attention, but just to say that he'd started through Carla's filing system, box by box, and he'd found things in it he hadn't known about: letters, photographs, a journal she'd kept during her second deployment that he hadn't known existed. She was funny, he said. She was really funny in this journal. I don't know how I forgot how funny she was. He didn't say anything else about it, and Ethan didn't ask him to, and they talked for a while about other things, and it was the right kind of phone call for a Tuesday evening in December. The visit to James Whitmore 3 weeks after the charging hearing, where Whitmore was doing his cardiac rehabilitation with the same approach he apparently brought to everything: disciplined, mildly resentful, fundamentally committed. And Ellen had bought a new coffee maker and was clearly pleased about it and insisted everyone have 2 cups. And Whitmore rolled his eyes at the second cup and drank it anyway. How's the investigation looking? Whitmore asked Maya. Nothing's moving forward, she said. The prosecution timeline has the preliminary hearing in February. He's going to prison, Whitmore said, not a question. And prosecutor is thorough, Maya said. That's what Okafor says. Good, Whitmore said. He drank his second coffee with the expression of a man who has decided to accept what's in front of him. It was as Torres had said, outside the courthouse, not big eyes. It was just correct, the thing going back to where it should have been. Last week of November. Arrived at the house on Caraway Street with a seal on the envelope that Ethan recognized because he'd spent 3 weeks researching military records and bureaucratic processes in preparation for filing a benefits claim. Pacific Command, Admiral Karen Bryce's office. He left it on the table for his mother unopened, which cost him something, but was the right thing. She opened it that evening. She read it standing at the counter, didn't sit, just stood and read it. And when she was done, she set it down and stood there with her hands flat on the counter, the same way she'd stood after Torres' call. But the quality of it was different. Processing. More like receiving. Ethan waited. It's a formal letter of recognition, she said, from Bryce's office, acknowledging the original service classification. The decorated status, the 2004 operation. She paused, acknowledging that the failure of the system to maintain accurate records was a failure of the system's duty to the people who served within it. She paused again. It's signed by Bryce personally. Ethan looked at the letter from across the kitchen. Is that what you wanted? He said. She thought about it for a long moment. what I needed, she said. What I needed, I mostly gave myself over the past 20-odd years by doing the work and raising you and not falling apart. She picked up the letter and read it again, just a portion of it. It's the right thing, it needed to exist. She set it down. Yes, it's what I wanted. He nodded. She folded the letter along its original crease and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope on the counter. I'm going to frame it, she said, which surprised him more than almost anything she'd said in the past 6 weeks, because Maya Reynolds did not frame things or display things or put things on walls where visitors could see them. He said. Not out here, she said. In my room. She looked at him. It's for me, not for visitors. That was entirely her, and he understood it completely. Ethan turned 18 in January. Maya made actual food, the real kind. A kind that required more than one pot. An OC came down from Seattle, and Farrar brought the Malinois and 2 of the other Ridgway dogs, because Farrar's idea of appropriate gathering size always included at least 2 dogs. And Okafor came and brought wine that nobody had asked for, but everybody appreciated, and Torres came with a cake from a bakery in Beaverton that was genuinely good. They ate around the table that had become the kitchen table again. Not the operations center, not the investigation hub, just the table where people sat and ate and talked. More. Called during the main course and yelled happy birthday into the phone over Ellen's laughing in the background, which caused enough noise that Farrar's Malinois stood up briefly to assess the situation and then sat back down, satisfied. After dinner, after everyone had gone, Ethan sat at the table with his mother in the clean kitchen, the way they'd sat so many times before everything. And after everything, just the 2 of them in the warm house, with the October turn, November turn, January outside. What do you want, she said. She meant in the large sense. In your life sense, he'd been thinking about it. He'd been thinking about it since October, since the waiting room, since the first time he sat in a hallway outside a conference room and watched Marcus Vail walk past in civilian clothes with a lawyer beside him. And felt something settle in him that wasn't satisfaction, but was the beginning of direction. He said military Laudicor eventually. Veterans advocacy. Something in that space. He'd looked at programs. He'd researched. He'd done it the way he'd done the benefits application thoroughly, without telling her until he knew what he was talking about. I want to know how to make the system work for people who should be able to use it and can't. I looked at him across the table. I know, he said, preempting her. Long Road Law School bar exam, the JAG application process. I know it's not a straight line. I wasn't going to say that, she said. What were you going to say? She was quiet for a moment. You've already started, she said. Whether you know it or not. She looked at him with the full expression, not the precursor, not the controlled version, but the actual thing which was rarer and therefore worth more. Hawkins, you walked into a government office with a folder of documents, and you told the truth in a room designed to make truth difficult to say. That's the beginning of what you're talking about. He looked at the table, the scratch on the left corner from when he was 11. I was scared, he said. I know. She said I didn't show it. I know that too, she said. That's the part that counts. Outside. The January wind was doing what January wind did in Portland, pressing against the windows, moving through the gap in the south-facing trim that he kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing, because there was always something more immediate. The house made its settling sounds. The lights were on in the kitchen the way they always were. He thought about 12 people standing in front of a vehicle in a photograph, most of them not smiling. He thought about the weight of an unfinished debrief carried for 2 decades in the body of a woman who'd never once asked anyone to notice. He thought about 41 names on a list, each one a person who had done something real and been told by a database that they hadn't, and the years those people had spent not knowing the database was lying. He thought about what it costs to be dismissed, not just the material costs, the benefits, the coverage, the money, but the other kind. The cost to the internal architecture, the way it pressed against a person's ability to trust their own experience, their own memory, their own account of what they'd done and survived. And he thought about what it looked like when that got reversed. When the record was corrected, and the charges were filed, and the letter with the seal arrived, and the folder from Beaverton held the evidence that a meticulous woman had kept against exactly this eventuality. When a 17-year-old refused to move away from a counter. When a phone call was returned at 11:43. When an Admiral put herself in a contact field in 2007 and waited for a reason. It didn't look like a movie. It looked like a kitchen table in a manila envelope with a number on it, and a folder of documents that took 3 weeks to assemble, and a dog in a hallway that sat down when the room went quiet. It looked like ordinary people doing the specific and unglamorous work of refusing to accept that wrong was the same as final. He said. I'm glad I filed. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his, the same gesture she'd made to Torres in a different kitchen in a different moment, not long, just enough. Just the contact that meant I know in the language they'd built between them over 17 years of figuring out how to be two people in a house together without either of them dissolving. Then she withdrew her hand and stood up and said, fix the trim this weekend. Before it gets worse, I will, he said. She went to her room. He sat at the table a little longer in the warm kitchen, in the house on Caraway Street, in the city that had turned out to contain more than either of them had known when they arrived in it, and thought about all the rooms with locked doors that are only locked, because no one has yet decided to open them and what becomes possible when someone does.